Hello, everyone, and thanks for listening. So, this is entitled How the U.S. Government Locked Black Americans Out of Attaining the American Dream. And this article is also coming from a person I had previously read an article from the same individual, and it's in politics, it's in the Splinter as well. And it shows you a photo here of uh, a neighborhood, a typical Black neighborhood um, that probably had primarily African Americans, and it doesn't look very favorable, does it? If you see it here, pictured here. So anyway, the article goes on to read that the wealth gap between white Americans and Black Americans is stark. So the median white family has somewhere between 10 and 16 times the net worth of median Black household, depending on who you ask. Between 2010 and 2013, as white households began to recover from the recession, Black and Hispanic families saw that their net worth had dropped an additional 20%. So Mirza Bardardran, a law professor, excuse me if I demolished her last name, at a University of Georgia, researchers banking law, how the U.S. government, in conjunction with the financial sector, has exacerbated economic inequality. So in her new book, The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Wealth Gap, she tracks the persistence of the racial wealth gap from the end of slavery to now, today. So I'm going to say Mirza because her last name, Bardaren, thoroughly diagnoses the ways that the U.S. government and white-owned banks have historically shut out Black Americans from prosperity, while boosting white Americans into the middle and upper class. I talked with Mirza about the structural causes of inequality and cynical political messaging around Black entrepreneurship and white politicians, and Jackie Robinson foray into the banking. So there was an interview that was condensed for clarity. So it goes on to say, let's start at the beginning. So what is the genius of the racial wealth gap? So it starts with slavery. So they go in a whole thing about slavery on up to today. So it says, when we fought over slavery and as an institution, it dissolved, we never confronted the justifications around it. And so this is the problems we're having today. And so a lot of people wonder, well, why are people angry? Why is it people are not happy and happy with what they have? Well, some people feel that they could have had a lot more had these type of things hadn't been happening, and hadn't, like what they're happening right now, hadn't been happening as they are today. So those things lingered, which they still do. And so did this desire, this need, especially in the South, to use Blacks as labor and not capital. So Black bodies were capital, but Blacks themselves could not control the capital. So they had to be the labor. So that lingered well after slavery. So in order to create wealth, you need capital. And if you are a capital, and if you're only subscribed as labor-based on the Jim Crow laws, which is exactly the purpose of Jim Crow in the Southern economy post-slavery, then you can't build any wealth. So that's the genius of the wealth gap. So what I show in the book is that it doesn't resolve itself. From the Civil War until today, the wealth gap has barely budged. In fact, the total amount of wealth owned by the Black population has not grown at all appreciably, not noticeably, but in the last 150 years. So you don't actually need racists for this gap to get wider and wider. So you don't actually need laws, and you don't even need a racist person or racist people for these things to work. But you don't need outright racism. You don't need outright slavery for the wealth gap to perpetuate. Once you've blocked a group of people from the mainstream arteries of commerce, they can't create any wealth. So I show how the economy has segregation and the economy of exclusion, how that self perpetuates. So you don't actually need racists for this gap to get even wider and wider as it has today. So, especially now, and the economic inequality is so strident that just makes it that much more exacerbated for Black people who have faced these economic injustices for centuries. When you're on the margin, any economic collapse hits you much, much more harder. There's this old adage that when Wall Street gets a cold, Harlem gets the flu. So when you've got people who live in communities of concentrated poverty and generational lack of opportunity, when you add a general financial crisis to that, it really provides a shock that's much harder to recover from. Yes, there is this trend of economic inequality with the 1% separating and the 99%, so to speak. But this also is a separate and distinct problem apart from the economic inequality. Just as inequality is tied up to banking and credit policies, Black exclusion and racial wealth gap is also tied up in racial exclusion from the channels of credit and banking that the rest of Americans were able to get generational wealth through. Post New Deal until the late 70s, the way that the middle class Americans gain wealth is through home ownership. Okay, that's back on the other article that I talked about earlier. So, all of that was given through banks and through credit facilities that were only open to certain classes of people, which were white, which was white privilege, which they so deny till this day. And they were also always closed off to Blacks, at first expressively and then effectively. Okay, let's talk about the flip side of that, racial inclusion, how historically middle class white people were included in these sweeping government programs that helped them get a business loan, get a college education, and get a nice new home. I feel like that something that gets left out of the conversation is delineating how many sweeping government programs were there have been with the express purpose of building up white wealth, which is white privilege once again, to the extent that white Americans became middle class. And it is through the credit infrastructure that was bolstered and sponsored by the federal government. Starting in 1934, there are all of these agencies and programs: the Homeownership Loan Corporation, the Federal Housing Administration, the FDIC insurance program that loosen up credit and capital. All of a sudden, mortgage credit was abundant. Anyone who could get mortgage credit, blue collar workers, could afford a mortgage. A mortgage became much more affordable or attainable than renting in the city. And so they all moved out of the suburbs. The most important distinction for those who could get these mortgages or not was the race of them. Once again, your privilege being the race you are as white. They mapped out the country through racial zones, redlining. This was explicit through government programs. This was created with white suburbs and created generational prosperity. It also created the Black ghettos. The wealth gap existed before then because the Jim Crow segregation and the segregation, but in the 20th century, these government credit facilities cemented the wealth gap for our generation, which is us now. Even as we have the Civil Rights era and the Civil Rights Act outlaws de jure Jim Crow, all of these economic cycles and processes remain intact still. So banks are the engines and the economy. And when you just dissect these engines, and I do it through looking at their loans and their deposits. You see that exactly how white banks create wealth, and you see exactly how black banks are stuck in this trap of segregation and concentrated poverty. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, JFK is assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson is out of office, and you have Nixon confronted with the new Civil Rights Coalition, which is the Black Empowerment Movement. And this awkward, weird thing happens with black banks. It is that they become this decoy when Nixon says, okay, you want black power, you want wealth. Here, I'm going to give you black capitalism. And what that means, Nixon, is you owe the problem of black poverty now. You own it. So after a generation of white Americans gaining wealth through these federally subsidized credit structures, all of a sudden Nixon points to the free market and says that the black community, best of luck. So here a lot of, well, if only education, if only family values, if only blah, blah, blah. And I don't hear a lot of self-reflection and historically accurate understanding of the forces at play here. So a lot of people will hit you with that. You know, they tend to blame black people for their poverty rather than blame the system of things that created it. So how has the ideology of black capitalism and individualism and bootstrapping, like I said, as an effective measure rather than the government support persistent since Nixon era? This is something that goes back to Frederick Douglass. This is not new. This is an idea that black communities are engaged in self-help. This is the robust history of blacks saying, okay, fine, you're going to do the Jim Crow. So you're going to impose segregation. Well, we'll mobilize and get our resources together, as little as they are, and we'll help ourselves. This starts from the second that the Civil War ends. I talk in the first chapter of the book, Freedmen's Savings Bank. And if you've heard this, some people on YouTube and other sites have mentioned the Freedmen's Savings Bank. That was the first bank to post-slavery. Frederick Douglass told slaves to invest their money in. Once the 40 acres and a mule was vetoed and by Andrew Johnson, they said, okay, save your money and then you can get land. But the white owners of the banks took all these deposits by the freed slaves and their hard-earned money. And imagine how hard it was to earn money as a freed slave. And they speculated them in railroad ventures and they lost them. And so the money was not backed by the full faith and credit of the federal government. And so the slaves thought it was. So the money was just gone. Poof. So you see that again with the Black movement, it's a worthy cause, but it's fantastic. It's a fantastic movement to say, but let's mobilize Black wealth, which you hear people talking about that even today. So, but I want to tell you that the white community, we all created this wealth gap. Okay, let me read that by you again. But I want to tell you, the white community, we all created this wealth gap. We all non-Blacks benefited. I'm repeating that again. We all non-Blacks benefited from this wealth gap. And that the only policy solution we've ever offered is that Blacks bear the burden of it themselves. Why should Black banks solely be focused on the wealth gap? Why don't white banks also take on this? That's a question to ponder, even till this day. Okay. They still benefit from it. That's why I'm answering it right now. So the federal government has been bolstering white banks, not to just since the New Deal, but look at the recent financial crisis of 2008. Did not Federal Reserve and the American taxpayer save these 5 to 8 huge, too big to fail banks? And that was the taxpayers' money that did that with the bailouts that I was mentioning to you in 2008. So why is the taxpayer money only going to the banks to save the banks are relying on the support of just the Black community alone. So, who do you hope reads this book and maybe comes away with it with a different perspective, of course? I wrote it for people who are curious about the wealth gap and who are curious about how to make a better democracy. I wrote it because with Black people in mind, of course, and I tried to put the voice of Black leaders and Black bankers forefront. But this is not the exhortation to the Black community. This is an explication of a problem. So I'm in the liminal space. So I'm neither Black or white. I'm sort of this outsider, but I have a perspective on the observer of the banking industry. And I'm speaking as someone and how the wealth is created. So it's the law of the markets. It's supply and demand that created this wealth. And I heard a lot of, well, if only education, if only your family values, and blah, blah, blah. So basically blaming it on Blacks why they're going through the problems of the racial wealth gap. And I don't hear a lot of self-reflection and historical accurate understanding of the forces at play here. So I'm myth busting. So in this book, I hope that it is read by people who are interested in understanding something about America. This is the line of argument that arises so often in talking about race relations in America, looking at policing rather than saying, you know, we do not need to address white on Black police brutality. You see the reaction of, well, what about Chicago? Which they always go to, Chicago, Black on Black crime. So look at the violence there, as if Black Americans don't deserve to live in productive and safe neighborhoods and has to have safe lives until Black single handedly fix every social problem that they go through, that for some reason are defined as only their problems, that they own it. So Martin Luther King says that there's a mass unemployment and lack of wealth in the Black community, and we consider that a sociological problem, but we don't call it what it really is, which is depression and recession. And when there is a mass lack of wealth in the majority community, we say, oh, this is the economic problem. This is the economic problem, which really is like ignoring what people are actually really having a lot of the economic problem, which are African Americans, we need to deal with. I don't talk about policing and criminalization, but I do see that all of that is wrapped up in economics of itself, of course. If there's poverty, there's going to be crime in those neighborhoods, of course. So we should all know that. But some people always like to pin the blame on the people who are hit the hardest. So why was Walter Scott running? Because he owed this debt and the police was coming after him. Why did he owe this debt? Blacks owe way more in debt than whites. They are much more resort to payday lenders Blacks are 60% unbanked and underbanked, which means that they rely on fringe lenders compared to 15% of whites in the same category. So all of these problems blend together in the school to prison pipeline over policing in the neighborhoods. Yes, let's reform police, but let's also figure out what is the root cause of these problems. After the Great Depression, when we had mass unemployment and the wealth inequality, we didn't blame poor people and say, hey, how did you get yourself in this position? Why is there crime? Maybe it's because of the lack of family values. We said, this is an economic issue and let's offer some economic solutions. This is what we need to do with the Black community, the same. But, you know, that hasn't happened and it's still not going to happen. There's no amount of less avocado toast that you can grandfather. Okay, so it goes on to talk about FHA loans. And so it'll go on in detail about those as well. So I'm going to stop here. different things like that. Different things like that are key marginalization of communities. Those are key signs, ghetto mentality, that there's something bigger at play here. It has been a whole system that has worked against a group of decades and has never been resolved. And it's what I've been always saying. And that is the reason why we face the problems that we do till this very day. And nobody has been really ever held accountable to we must fix this together. It's always placed upon the particular group and a blame on that particular group. So that I thought, if you want to read the later part of the article to its entirety, how the U.S. government, and it's by Emma Roller once again. I thought it was a very interesting article, and it says a lot and it hits home, and it is very, very true. And so happening before and has never really been resolved. And the more you go on, you start to see that, there's a lot of accountability, and there's people that just don't want to admit that they've benefited from a system that favored one group and ignored another and isolated and exiled others. And so it still persists. So with that being said, I'm going to cut this video, and thanks for listening.